Oh, there it goes.
We are live. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
Welcome to SpaceTimeMind. I think that we are now recording like our 27th hour.
Wow.
SpaceTime. We've been laying down a lot of fresh beats.
It only feels like forever.
Yeah. It's still a finite number.
It's still a finite
number. A very large finite number. I'm Pete Mandick from William Patterson University, and it's raining here in New Jersey.
Yes, I'm Richard Brown. It's also raining here in Brooklyn, as a matter of fact.
Wow.
Cold and dreary day, much reminiscent of winter, which won't let go of us. Apparently they keep telling us, though, that this is one of the warmest winters on record, except just not where we happen to live.
Yeah. I gotta say, every time the weather is just slightly unpleasant, I get completely depressed about climate change. I'm like, This is it. We're the last generation.
We're the last generation.
This is it. Hey, by the way, I want to try an experiment today.
Yeah.
I'm going to set an alarm.
Okay.
A 30-minute alarm.
Oh, crap.
And when that alarm goes off, we will know it's been 30 minutes.
Okay. Why are we doing that?
We go long.
We go long. Okay, so we're trying to tighten it up.
And also, we get breathless, and it makes it hard. It makes it hard for the editor to find a place to break.
Oh, I see. You're trying to post some order from the standpoint of an editor.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the editor.
You know, now that you brought that up, I was figuring that it was about time that we talk about time on Space
I really want to talk about time. I want to talk about time, too. By the way, I was listening to one of our sister podcast, New Books in Philosophy. Are you familiar with that one?
Carrie does that one. Yeah, I like it.
Carrie Finger and Rob Talese. And
I only listen to the Carrie side of it, to be honest with you, because she does all the cool mind stuff.
Yeah, she
does.
Other
one, the Rob seems like he's more does like political stuff or something, and that's not less interesting. It's just I have not infinite time.
Right. He does political philosophy and ethics, and then allegedly some epistemology, and then Carrie does the metaphysics and philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. Anyway, the reason I bring it up is just yesterday I was listening to the one with Britt Brogard.
Okay.
And she was talking about her
she
book.
Has that Transient Truths, that book?
Right. She was talking about that Transient Truths book, and a lot of it gets into time. So a lot of these arguments about time, on the one hand, you've got straightforward metaphysics of time. And on the other hand, there's this philosophy of language stuff about like, what's the right way to think about propositions? Are they eternal? Or are they timeless stuff? And that gets into things about linguistics and whether we have tense operators in language, or whether instead like what's really going on is some kind of quantifier. And then of course there's like cool psychology stuff. So maybe we'll have a whole bunch of different episodes about time. But there's a lot of stuff about just the phenomenology of time, the way the mind processes time, or the experience of time.
Yeah. Well, who knows if we'll have time to talk about all these interesting topics about time. I'm going to be doing this all day, folks, so you may as well just set it in.
The bad jokes are the best jokes.
What's interesting, too, is, because I think this is right, so what's also interesting is all these really cool connections between views about space, which you can have analogs to in temporal as well, and also views about modality, which we've been talking about. So the package of views that I would like is, if possible, is a kind of presentism that has only the present moment as real, and then in the modal world, a kind of actualism where the only things that are real are the actually existing things. And so those two views, actualism and presentism,
wait a minute,
are nice. I like them. I thought
you didn't like actualism.
I love actualism. What are you talking about?
Because you're all, you love modality.
I do. I take modality seriously, but that's a different question. So yeah, I mean, these are different questions. So look, I mean, we've been through this before. So
but let me just be super clear.
The thing about modality was mostly I was kind of shocked and mortified that people who endorse crazyism wouldn't also sort of be amendable to this kind of crazy view, because it just seems like one of the possible crazy options. I mean, yes, it's crazy to say that everything necessarily exists and that S5 is the appropriate logic for settling metaphysical disputes. My point wasn't that I believe that. My point is why is it that a view that's crazy but motivated by a priori methodology is not a serious contender, whereas a view that's crazy but motivated by empirical methodology is a serious or worth taking serious. That was mostly why I was like defending the view. And also I think it's interesting, and I do think that we have an ability to think about the truth of counterfactuals in a way that renders talk about modality interesting and important. Whether what that tracks or what, I don't know. But so I also think that it would be nice to defend the view that what's real is what's actual and present. Whether you can be forced away from that is what I kind of think is interesting.
But if you're king of philosophy, if you get to just by fiat make it true, you'd pick presentism and actualism. So that covers time and that covers modality. But what about space?
Yeah, see, that's the interesting thing. So I was reading this paper by Dean Zimmerman, and I actually forget what the name. I don't even know if this is a new paper or old paper.
But he's a big-time presentist.
Yeah, he's exactly. That's why I like him.
Also Christian.
Yeah, you know, this view does, and one of the defenders of presentism is William Lane Craig. So I'm not in great company here. And I don't want to I wouldn't want to defend the view that they do, especially what Craig's view of the neo-Lorentzian or whatever, that kind of strange view that there is some like absolute reference frame, which is objective, and that's God's reference frame. As far as I understand Craig's view, that's kind of what his position is. So and you know, whatever. Like I said before in our previous episode, I'm agnostic about theism, so I don't mind exploring religious views like that. I don't really, think there's a lot of reason to believe them. That's why the agnosticism.
Yeah.
But yes, I would. So anyway, yeah, I was reading this paper of his where he was. I forgot why what brought.
I asked you about space. You told me about your.
That's right. Okay, thank you.
Package.
I started thinking about something completely different, Pete. You're getting me distracted. So anyway, I think I'm not exactly clear at the moment what his conclusion was. I think his conclusion was substantialism or substantivalism about space is, I don't know if required but congenial to presentism. I think that's what he was arguing, but I'm not sure. So it's not clear to me what to say about space. I guess I would say, yeah, that space is that substantivalism is a common sense view. Yeah. But I'm also convinced by like holographic principles and sort of thinking about string theory that it's quite an open possibility that space is not fundamental, not a fundamental feature of our world, but an emergent feature of it. So I'm not. Space probably. I mean, it's harder to give up time than it is to give up space, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Space. You can make sense. There are models in which space just sort of emerges, and it's not fundamental. It's not clear to me you can do the same thing with time, and I think that, but maybe it is. So I'm not sure.
Well, talking about
you're a relationalist, right? Is that what you is?
Yeah, like I gotta say, my man is Poincaré.
Poincaré,
hardcore. And Leibniz is pretty cool on this topic.
Yeah.
But as far as packages go, you might look to Einstein. And and then your package might just oppose Einstein. So Einstein glues time and space together.
Yeah.
Time is relative. Whether two events are happening at the same time or not is going to be something that's relative to a reference frame. And similarly, where things are, or how long they are, right? So there's like as things are moving, there's spatial contraction, right? Length contraction is part of the Lorentz transformation.
Right.
So that's a kind of relativity about both. but it's it's really weird because.
But but see, right? So Einstein, as far as I mean, look, this is these things are deep, but as far as I know, Einstein, there are two different ways of talking about this stuff. And one way of doing it is that anything that's sort of not invariant under the Lorentz transformations just isn't a real feature of the objects. So I mean, there's ways of reading Einstein where he says, yeah, well, length just is not like a real feature of a real property that physical objects have, and the reason is because it's not invariant. The things that are real, and this is, I think, the idea behind the people who say that rather than calling it relativity theory, you should call it invariance theory or invariantism, or rather, the idea is not that there's a bunch of relativity going on here. The idea is that there's something that's invariant, something that stays the same under certain transformations. And in the other stuff, well, we could debate about whether that's really real or not. I don't know. So,
but wait a minute. So, so here are some things that change under the transformations: length, mass.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So I've got a spaceship, and I would have thought it was real that it had a certain mass and that it had a certain length. And you tell me that neither of those things are real?
Well, they're relativistically real.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're the quantities that I mean, what is it they're talking about? In a certain inertial frame of reference or whatever, you'll measure certain, you'll come up with certain measurements. And so that's what those things are talking about. If you make this measurement, you'll get this number for mass. If you make that measurement, you'll get that number for length. Someone in a different, in a frame of reference moving relative to you will make different measurements.
Okay.
So it's an open question then, like what's the underlying thing like? Because really all they're talking about is the kinds of measurements that observers would make. I guess this again gets at this thing from Einstein, the difference between a theory of principle versus a constructive theory, which, I'm not really a super history of science guy, but I read some of this stuff. So as far as I understand it, like one kind of theory starts with just giving a sort of mathematical description, a principle, like the principle of relativity, or Einstein's claim that the laws of physics are the same in every reference frame. They're invariant under that transformation, the laws of physics, and so that you can't distinguish, Anyway, okay, so. But you don't give any kind of explanations. You just give some equations and explanations. Equations and descriptions. And then that constrains the kind of theory that you end up being able to produce. And then that's contrasted with a constructive theory, where you actually try to do some explaining of how the thing that you observe comes out to be true.
Yeah.
So, and the way I understand this, like, people view like Lorentz's physics itself as a kind of constructive theory, because he was trying to give an explanation for why you would see these kinds of invariances or these transformations that you could make. Whereas some people view Einstein as not trying to do that, but rather just trying to give some general principles that constrain your theory and then construct a theory based on that. So.
Let me shift slightly and ask you a question about presentism. Because, I go back and forth about presentism. Sometimes I feel, like, especially when I'm meditating, I focus on, and I teach a class on this too next semester.
Yeah, you mentioned that. That sounds interesting.
So when I'm in that frame of mind, like, I really become a presentist. Like, this is what's really real. But then other times I think, like, okay, I think like, I'm attracted to actualism too.
Yeah.
And one thing that goes along with actualism, it doesn't have to, but one thing that goes along with ism is there's only one actual future.
Right.
So, but anyway, so here's something against.
Not if the future is open. There are many possible futures, but only one of them will be actual. Yeah.
But if you're an actualist, the only possibilities are actual. But anyway, let me.
Well, that's not true. That's not.
I said you didn't have to go this way. But that's one way to go.
Okay.
Let me give you this thing that bothers me about presentism.
Okay. Yeah.
That is kind of like a specious present kind of point. So one way of thinking about
that it seems smeared out or something, is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. So one way of putting presentism is that the only time that's real is this single instant But if you think about lots of things that we experience, it's pretty clear that we don't just experience single instants. So, for example, you can see my hand move, or you can, like right now, you're hearing that I'm saying the word asparagus, right?
I did hear that.
So so asparagus has a lot of syllables in it, and there's a sense in which you're hearing, like right now, you're hearing asparagus, right? Asparagus is in the present. So asparagus, as far as time goes, it's got more temporal extent than a single instant. And same with motion, like you're perceiving that my hand is moving right now. And one way to think about motion is being at different locations at different times.
Right.
So like what counts as now is already going to contain multiple points in time, some of which are earlier than others.
Right. I mean, so this to me... Is
there a way for the presentists to just like redefine what they mean by the present?
I think that's an interesting question. So, it's difficult. So, because I agree with you, I feel that specious present stuff as well. I do think about this stuff. So, one thing that we should say is that we want to distinguish the metaphysics from the phenomenology. So, one question is like, what's real? And then what is the phenomenology of temporal passage like, or of time passing like? And so I feel you describing the phenomenology, I think, very well. That's what it feels like. That's how we experience time when we pay attention to it, not as an instantaneous moment, but as an extended little bubble, a kind of thing, a little area, which is... You know, I don't want to say the moving spotlight, because that has already a bunch of baggage in philosophy when people talk about this moving spotlight view, you know. But I think Dean Zimmerman kind of captures this in his paper when he talks about this ghostly growing block, that there's this kind of idea that, you know, the past is like, there's this kind of fadingness, but there's this glowing edge, this glowing like thing at the forefront of it. And how long of a moment that is, I don't know. I mean, I think you're right that the presentist doesn't need to be forced into saying it's an instant. But then, of course, you get a slip. I mean, I don't know though. I'm just like speculating. But then you get I think the interesting question of how accurate or reliable is the phenomenology. Since it's quite plausible, I mean not plausible, but I can imagine someone saying that the specious present is just the way we represent many instantaneous moments or something like that, and so that's a product of the representation of time, subjective or experience of time, rather than what's real. But I mean, but you don't want to say that though, because I think one of the strongest arguments for accepting some kind of presentism is phenomenology. Whatever those B theories are, or eternalism, or I mean, I think those are technically separate, but they're like closely related. And four-dimensionalism as well, technically separate but closely related. That whole like group of stuff, it's really hard for them to make sense of how time passes. And I like this. I mean, again, the phenomenology I think is so important here. This is a point that Pryor made a long time ago, I think. When he talks about like, because I don't know, I have migraines run in my family, so I'm not having one at the moment, but if you have a migraine headache, it's something that like seems like it lasts over time, and it's terrible, and it can go in and out. You can like be doing something else and then be like, oh, there's that migraine again. So I feel like, yeah, it's the same migraine, but eventually it goes away. If you're lucky. And it's this incredible relief that comes. So one of the things that Pryor talks about is, well, what happens when the headache goes into the past? What happens when that transition occurs from it being presently hurting to it being in the past that it hurt? And the B theories, eternalism, all those theories, they have this weird consequence. Well, that the pain still exists, you know, still real in some sense. It's got to at least be in some other sense, some attenuated sense. because it doesn't hurt. And if it were real, if that headache were real, it would still be hurting. But clearly, it's not hurting me anymore. So it's got to be. If it is real, it's real in a different sense. And I think that's an important point, that the past headache doesn't hurt us anymore. Now, I think Pryor kind of assumes from that automatically, boom, therefore presentism. I don't know if that you can do that as quick, but I do think that's kind of an interesting and important point, that you have to at least admit a mode of existence that's different and not as important as the one that's currently presently existing. And then, of course, you could look at this recent work in metaphysics on grounding, and you might wonder if you could tell. And I think I've read a paper on this recently. Some people arguing that you can use like Chris McDaniel and their work, like the work coming out of that weird tradition, to talk about the past being grounded in the present and maybe modes of being or something like that. So that's a weird and wacky view, but I think it's interesting.
So I want to go back to something you said and talk about two theories that account for it. So you said we got to distinguish between the question of the phenomenology of time and the metaphysical reality of time, and I think that's right. And once you really think hard about what that might amount to, there's two kinds of theories that I find each of them really compelling. So one of the theories says that the metaphysics is a kind of like super small instant. That's what's really real. And the other is some kind of eternalism. But on each of these theories, what you account for the phenomenology in terms of a kind of representationalism. It's just to make it super simple, we could call it belief, but of course you're probably going to want to make it more complicated and have different kinds of representations than beliefs. But anyways, just on the simplified version, on the instantaneous version, what's really happening is at this instant you have a belief, and then the belief is that there are more than one instance, one of which is a past instant that has a migraine in it. The other one is an instant that doesn't have a migraine in it. There's a sense in which this is kind of an error theory, because these, in a lot of ways, these beliefs are false. They're representing a bunch of stuff. They're representing a bunch of instants that aren't.
Is this related to Dennett's Stalinian or Orwellian stuff?
It's very Dennettian in flavor. It's very much like that, right? But the other way to go, once you see that is at least a possibility, another way to go is the same kind of story on the representation phenomenology side of things, but now the metaphysics is eternalist. So there are all these different, metaphysically, there's all these different Richard stages, and each of them have their own beliefs. Right. And one of them is there still believing, and correctly believing, that it has a migraine headache, and there's another Richard stage that is believing, and correctly believing, that it used to be having but no longer is having a migraine headache. So
that doesn't really do justice to having and not having headache, does it? I mean, that's not what you're saying, is it?
Well, there's a bunch of Richards, and some of them are still having the headache, and will always have the headache. You're the one right here. Right. But anyways, so there's both of these theories would be consistent with the phenomenology.
Well,
right, you've got this representation of what's going on, and the way things seem just is the way you represent them. And then now, but the metaphysics are radically different. In the one case, the metaphysics is that the only instant that is really real is this single point in time. Yeah. And the other one, it has this infinity of points in time with an infinity of like Richard stages.
You mentioned Britt and her work at the beginning of this.
Yeah,
I haven't read her. I haven't read that book, to be honest with you. But I have read her paper on this. I think. Oh, I know. I forget. I'm supposed to do homework before these shows. I think her paper was in the Monist. I could be totally wrong about that, but it's called Presentist four-dimensionalism. And it's a cool view that she defends in that. Do you know this paper, or do you? I mean, I think it's
I have
related to
come
quantum
across
Nova.
it.
Sorry.
I have come across it. I really don't remember how it's supposed to go, though. Do you?
I think I do remember I mean, I know we should talk to her someday, and she could
Yeah,
tell us
definitely.
because she probably knows this stuff better than we do, since it's her work.
Definitely. I would definitely.
But I think the idea. I mean, I don't know. Would interpret it in terms of the grounding kind of stuff that I was just talking about, but I don't know if she would want to assimilate it to that. But that the idea is that there's a that the four-dimensionalism is just the idea that you can, talk about these past times, refer to them, and that kind of stuff, and that but they don't have to exist in the same way that the present time does, and they exist in a way by being related to the present time. Um, and I mean, I don't know. So again, I would tell the story about grounding, that they're ground, but I don't know if that's the way she would want to do it. But I think that she has an interesting. So the thing that I remember most clearly, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering that first part of it, but the thing I remember most clearly is like what she tries to say about special relativity and the kinds of objections to presentists that comes from thinking about relativity theory, and really, general relativity is like, I think Zimmerman's right that that's what we should be worried about. But anyway, so as far as I understand, the kind of response that she's sketching there is that, if you take here's how she presents the objection to presentism. Is if and again, I could be misremembering this, but I think this is right. So suppose that, here I am, and I list a bunch of stuff that I think is currently existing, and you're one of them, right? So, and I also list, like, my tea jar right here, my jar of tea. So, but you're moving relative to me. So some event which is in your past relative to you is not going to be in my presently existing thing. Excuse me, something which is present relative to you because you're moving. So we're going to have different time slices here.
Right.
Something's going to be real in your frame of reference that's not real in my frame of reference. And so therefore it looks like presentism is committed to a contradiction, a formal contradiction, namely that this certain thing, let's call it the Battle of Gettysburg, just to have like a thing we're talking about. This particular event is not real because it's not in my present moment, and so therefore not existing. But you are, and it's in your frame of reference, so it's also is real since you're present, you're real and present in my frame of reference. So therefore it looks like it both is and isn't the case that this thing, the Battle of Gettysburg or whatever it is, is real. It exists, and so that's a one way of putting the objection from special relativity. So, and I think the interesting response that she develops, and then what I like about it is it doesn't require this move that other people are going to make, this neo-Lorentzian move that there is like an absolute frame of reference, an absolutely correct objective frame of reference. So the idea is that that she invokes what they call space-like separation between the events, whereby that means that they can't causally interact. So this Battle of Gettysburg is not something that, since nothing can travel faster than the speed of light, it's not something that I can know about. It's not something that is real or can affect the frame of reference that I happen to be in. And so her conclusion is there's nothing contradictory with saying that it's not real in my frame of reference, but it is in your frame of reference, because what's objectively real is just different frames of reference. And if they're separated in a space-like way so that they can't interact with each other, then there's just no contradiction or problem that arises. Especially if you have her kind of ghostly four-dimensionalism stuff in there that lets you still do all the stuff that you want to do.
I guess I don't see what's presentist about it. I hear it as I get the four-dimensionalist part of it. I don't see what's supposed to be presentist about it.
Well, it's not the case that that this thing exists. It's not real in my frame of reference, and that's true. I mean, the only things that exist are what are
real
existing
in some sense.
It's still real in some sense. So that's, that's her take on the four. That's her argument
Yeah.
that, you can't just have a three-dimensionalism. You can't just go. Now, I would want to have try to have some kind of pure three-dimensionalism. I don't know if that's possible, but
Right. Like
so
when I'm
she does give up a little bit, but it's not. I mean, these things aren't real in any sense that should matter or bother a
when
presentist.
when I'm in my
Um,
presentist mood, I would say, I want more than she's given me. That doesn't seem like presentism.
Well, if you say just, I mean, again, if you put it in terms of grounding, then how is that more than presentism? If you say,
What's the ground? Maybe I don't get what the ground is. What's the ground here?
um, the ground is the present,
So the ground
the things
contains,
which are real now.
and it's not Richard's present versus Pete's present. There is just some absolute present,
No, I think
non-relativized
she's. I mean, I think that's the
present.
relative. I mean, that's the why it's still in the framework of general relativity, special relativity, is that there's no absolute. There's no absolute present. There's no objective. That's the nice thing about this kind of move that she's making, I think, is that you don't have to say there's some objective time a reference frame from which this other stuff follows.
So there are
Again, I mean, I had to reread the paper.
Once again, we're talking about stuff we haven't read. Let me
I
ask
have
you.
read it. No, I have read it. I just haven't read it in a timely manner.
By the way, speaking of time,
Yeah.
we
That was half
we've
an
hit a
hour.
point. So we're going to take a virtual break. Okay, that
I
was our
know.
break. And now that we're back after the break, ladies and gentlemen,
Oh, that was the break.
yeah. So we hit the break point, and that's where the editor is going to insert like a pretty kick-ass musical break.
Yeah. So
Right,
you're gonna do it. Give them a little bit more because you get these little teases, but they're only a quick second.
I think they're a minute.
They're a minute. Yeah. Something.
But let me ask you about the flow of time, because some people that are presentists say that what they oppose about the non-presentists, they call them eternalists or whatever. I mean, I smush eternalism and four-dimensionalism all together. I know you're supposed to separate them, but
Yeah.
I'm
You're
sloppy
supposed
like
to
that.
separate them.
But anyway, the B theory people, they get accused of, and maybe correctly, of not really allowing for there to be any flow of time.
Yeah.
And there's this argument that I'm familiar with through Ted Sider. I don't know if he originates the argument, but he says, think about it. So this is an argument against the coherence of the idea that time flows.
Think about it.
He's like, think about it.
That's the argument.
End of argument. No, that's premise one.
For real, think about it. Whoa.
The first premise is get your head out of your ass. Second premise, think about it. Third premise is if time flows, it would have to flow at a rate. Now, what is a rate? A rate is some change with respect to time. So, for example, if your car is moving at a rate that's faster than my car, you're changing positions with respect to your spatial positions with respect to time in a way that exceeds my change of spatial positions with respect to time.
Right.
And if you're cooling down, you're changing temperatures. You've got different temperatures at different times. So rates of cooling down or rates of motion are always going to be relative to time. If time flows, you might wonder at what rate does it flow? And you're tempted to say, well, 1 second per second.
Yeah.
But wait a minute. 1 second per second isn't a rate. One second per second is just a fraction.
Right.
And it is the number 1. But the number 1 is not a rate. So you might say, like, oh, okay, let's do it this way.
1 moment per second.
Let's do it. No. Let's introduce hypertime.
Yeah, hypertime.
So maybe this is what you were saying. So time flows at a rate with respect to hypertime. But now, then the next stage of the argument is just it becomes a regress argument.
Yeah.
Does hypertime flow? If so, there must be some hypertime. And then does that flow? Then we've got hypertime. And off we go to an infinite regress.
Right.
And this, I don't know, I think that's, don't you like turtles all the way down, so you
I
seem
love
not to
them.
ever be fazed by an infinite regress argument.
I love turtles all the way down, and I simultaneously am living on the lowest turtle.
Well, you know, I am the lowest turtle.
Seriously, no, but you know, some
But if you care about grounding, or if you care about explanation,
with Cantor's continuum hypothesis,
wait, what?
some kind of analogy with Cantor and the continuum hypothesis can help us make sense of what it means to say that there are collections of things which are, you know, outstrip other collections of things that don't seem intuitively like they can be outstripped. So I'm not saying that that's a model of time. What I'm saying is that we know what it means to be hyper infinite in a sense, or in other words, to be uncountable. What it means is simply to have the cardinality of the continuum.
But look, suppose I say infinity is great.
Well, hold on though, and so probably that the cardinality of the continuum is probably closely related to time. When I mean, I would say when you I'm not, and so I don't know that what's the problem with having a hyper time, or in other words, a higher level of time in which you can make sense or count the moments of time of non-hyper time. And then the relativity thing, I mean, why does there have to be a metric? Because really I think what Sider's point of his question is about what metric is there. Is time is supposed to be a metric, so then what metric can you use for the metric? What thing, the limits or marks off, the clicks?
Well, the way I hear this infinite regress argument, and this is the way I hear most infinite regress arguments, it's not that you're positing infinity and infinity is bad. By the way, I think infinity is bad.
Yeah.
But I can play along. Like, I think infinity is great. It's terrific.
Yeah.
But, it's bad when what you're looking for is grounding, or when what you're looking for is explanation, right? So if you want an explanation of in what consists time flowing, and if you say, well, it's changing with respect to hypertime, you haven't answered the question yet. Well, what is the flow of hypertime consist in? And you say, well, it's hypertime.
Yeah,
well, what's that, right?
But that's the same thing that you could say, look, what does it mean to be uncountable? Well, it means that you can't be put into a one-to-one relationship with the natural numbers.
Yeah, but
then you say, well, what does that mean? Well, that's what it means. It means that you can't be put into a one-to-one
regress.
What?
There's no infinite regress there, right? So
yes, there is, because then there's a higher level of infinity, which is larger than that, so it can't be put into a one-to-one correspondence with the thing which is larger than the natural numbers, and then there's one that's larger than that, which cannot be put into a one-to-one correspondence.
Slow down. Let's
there's an infinite sequence of these.
Slow down. Let's talk about just focusing on one-to-one correspondence, right? This is really like if a student asked me, and actually I did this in class the other day. I was defining isomorphisms. Check this out. Here's an isomorphism. It was very visual. I didn't even have to turn on the computer. I was just using my hands. Right. I've got some digits over here, and I've got some digits over here, and
this is an audio podcast, right?
Oh, crap. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Mandic is holding up his hands. His gnarled roots, old man fingers. And but the radio listener grasps what it means to put the digits on my left hand into one-to-one correspondence.
And that's how you know you have the same number of digits on both hands.
Yeah, right. And so, but people don't say, but I still don't understand it.
Yeah.
They're like, they get it. So now let's talk about the integers.
Yeah.
And it's pretty easy to see that you could put the integers into one-to-one correspondence with the even integers.
Yeah.
So one maps onto you just think of this as times 2. So 1 maps onto 2, 2 maps onto 4, 3 maps onto 6, and so. And by the way, like, here's a puzzling thing about infinity. We've got an infinite set and another infinite set that some people have the intuitive pull. They want to say that the one is smaller than the other, right? Because the set of even integers is a proper subset of the set of integers. But nonetheless, they could be put into one-to-one correspondence.
And that's
right?
how you know they're the same size.
Yeah, but I don't see, like, we're not off to an infinite regress. Yes, we're talking about an infinite set in this case. With the hands, there were finite sets.
What I'm talking about is that you can't put the real numbers you can't put the real numbers into a one-to-one correspondence with the integers.
Right. Yeah, the diagonalization argument is
that's
one
right.
way
So there
of showing that.
So then we have a larger size of infinity, an uncountable number.
Right.
But we could still put that uncountable number in a one-to-one correspondence with the next higher level of infinity, and then there would be more left over. So there's a higher, larger number of infinite size, by which you could sort of mark or index the one which is already uncountable. So I'm not talking about and there is an infinite hierarchy of larger and larger cardinal numbers.
Yeah, but I don't see how that's a regress.
Well, because it never stops. What do you mean?
But a regress is when you're asking for an explanation and then you don't actually get the explanation.
You were just saying, by how could you keep track of this thing? And I said you invoke a higher level thing that has more units in it by which to index those lower order things.
Well, it wasn't.
And then you said, well, how do you keep track of that? I said, well, there's a higher order thing.
You're putting words in my mouth. I didn't say keep track.
Cantor numbers.
I didn't say keep track.
To index them, to mark the passage.
I said, I want to know in what consists the passage of time.
It's one succeeding the other.
What is?
It's analogous to the successor relationship. It's the relation of being next, being after. That's what we atheists like to say. It's after. Now, what rate does after occur? That's what the cider question is. What's the rate at which after or next comes?
Yeah, what's the rate?
And that might be a meaningless question, or you might be able to make sense of it in terms of a higher level, a hyper time. Or now, by analogy, I was saying the same way you can make sense of the cardinality of these numbers in terms of by talking about it from a higher cardinality.
But
and that would give you the tools to then say what's going on at the lower level, and it never stops.
So I want to know about the cardinality of the integers.
Yeah.
And the cardinality of the even integers.
Right.
I don't need to appeal to any higher cardinalities.
Right.
So if Cantor just introduces set theory and starts out with the cardinality of these countable sets and then stop there, I wouldn't be like, oh, I still don't get it.
Right.
Right. He didn't need to get into higher cardinalities for me to understand what the cardinality of the even integers was.
Right, but he did in order for you to understand what the cardinality of the reals is.
But he didn't need to do it for me to understand the cardinality. So in order to understand the lowest level cardinality, there doesn't have to be an appeal to the higher level cardinality, right?
Right.
Well, then I win. I win this argument because that's a disanalogy to Sider's hypertime argument.
It's not, because you're not trying to understand the lower level cardinality. You're trying to count it.
No, but you're
trying to give a sense in which one is after the other one, how it proceeds in an order.
You're trying to, but look, in the time case, you're trying to understand what is the flow of time, and you say, well, it's changed with respect to hypertime. And you're like, well, yeah, but what's hypertime? Doesn't it flow? And what?
Well, that's one possible answer. The other possible answer is that's a meaningless question. So I want to make sure we understand that you could pull a Hume here and simply say the series is just this, the existence of the series is the explanation of the series. There's nothing left over. It's just it proceeds at that rate. That's it. Or you could even say there is no set rate. I'm not against that. I think that the rates could be variable. I think that if you're moving faster than me, your rate might be different than mine. So there doesn't have to be an objectively correct metric at which time passes, although it would be I mean, Newton. So this is a very Newtonian question because Newton definitely had this idea that there was pure mathematical, absolute mathematical time was preceded at a sort of.
Wait, can you say more about the first option?
The first option being
called it Humean, or it's like you just say it's a meaningless question. You say more about that?
Well, I take it that it's by analogy to what he says to the cosmological argument, whereby you say what's the explanation of the series of contingent beings, and he says the explanation is that each contingent being was caused by the previous contingent being, and then you say, yeah, but what explains the existence of the whole series? And he says, well, that each member of the series was caused by the previous member of the series. That explains the existence of the series. So
I got to read up on my Hume.
Okay.
I didn't know. Oh man, there's a big giant hole in my Hume.
What do you mean? Maybe I'm reading. It's just not Hume.
Oh no, I'm not trying to raise an objection. That probably is Hume. I just.
This is like from the philosophy of religion debates. The way I think that
Yeah, if you ask me, what does he say? What does Hume say about the cosmological argument? I say, oh fuck, I bet he said something, but I don't remember what it was.
Okay. Well, okay. So and the people have written about this, I think, and maybe this is a reconstruction of it. He probably doesn't put it in exactly that way, but anyway. So whoever said that, why can't you just take a similar kind of that's a meaningless question response to your demand for a rate at which time passes? I mean, it's not. Yeah. So look, you might ask this question too. The natural numbers, at what rate do they succeed each other? Well, I don't know. 2 comes after 1. 3 comes after that. But at what rate, you say to me? Well, is that a meaningful question for the natural numbers? No, there's just succession of them.
So we started with this. I asked you because you're playing a presentist today, right? You got the presentist hat on. And,
sure.
I said, well, do you think that time flows? Because a lot of presentists, they say part of their case is that
we demand that time flows.
We demand it. We want flow.
We demand nothing but maximal flow.
When do we want it? Now.
We want it now. Wait now. We
want everything now.
No, really what we want it, though, is continuously. I mean, look, that's the beauty of differential equations is that they capture this idea that it's continuous. That's really the idea. It's a passing from a continual passing from then to now, and that the difference between now and then. By the way, I'm having a war in my head between the Spaceballs episode part where he says, "When is this? Now? No, then?" And they're watching the movie. So, and then also the George Carlin, "When? Now? Then?" That routine that he does.
No, I don't know the Carlin. I know the Spaceballs one. I'm
having them simultaneously playing in my head right now, and I can't deal with it. And also talk about saying now and then. But you should look up the Carlin. By the way, Carlin is a genius. He's a master of comedy. He's a very smart dude.
Yeah, he's a deep philosopher.
100% with all of his political views. I mean, it's really sad to me that he's dead. But anyway, so end rant.
But when you say this option where you say like this is a meaningless question, does that include the question of whether time flows?
No, it flows. I think it's the question of whether if there's a rate that it flows at, that might be meaningless, or not meaningless, but not objectively settled. Relativity is weird, but I also think that it's important to point out that relativity theory is going to look different by the time we figure out how to deal with quantum gravity and whether it looks like string theory or whether it looks like something else like quantum loop gravity, or if that's even still a real thing. I think it is. But anyway, so my money's on string theory. It has been. I've always been a fan of string theory since high school, actually, when I first heard about it. So I think that there's something, and for me, the big thing about string theory was always that strings are extended objects. So point particles always bothered the shit out of me, and I never understood how people could seriously say that the physical world was composed of point particles.
By the way, I agree with you, but I'm also reminded of that Colin McGinn book about physics.
Oh, I don't. Yeah,
you've heard about it, right? It's one of He had a couple books that got like ripped in reviews.
I read the reviews, but I don't know Colin. I don't approve of him.
but anyway, but one of the things he gets ripped on in this physics book is he's talking about how theoretical physicists have really overlooked the question of what the shapes of the particles are, and the reviewer calls this Colin McGinn's Lucky Charms theory of physics.
Exactly. They've stolen me Lucky Charms.
They're always out to get me Lucky Charms.
Oh, that is classic. But look, no, strings are extended objects. They're one-dimensional objects, and it's not a mystery how you get more dimensions out of one dimension. It is a mystery how you get any dimensions out of 0 dimensions. So I mean, anyway, so that's the thing that attracted me to string theory, was that more than that, it explained gravity. And although people like Ed Whitten, and I take that seriously, you know, I don't know how people feel about this, but some people say string theory has never made any empirical predictions. And Ed Whitten, you know, he's famously made the comment that it did make a prediction. It predicted gravity. It just predicted it after we already discovered it. But that if you theorize or imagine a hypothetical society like a race of aliens, they could have discovered string theory first, and then they would have predicted gravity as a result of string theory, and that would have been, you know, it just so happened we got that gravity was the first force that we really got mathematically serious about. And you know, I don't know, some people think that's not so great. So I say, I don't know. I think I can make sense of what Whitten's saying there. So I think string theory does have that going for it, and also the dimensionality and some other stuff. But anyway, so and if string theory is right, then like I was saying earlier, then space-time might not be fundamental, at least not in the Minkowski space-time manifold sense, which you have a combined joint fabric of space and time. If space really is an emergent property, but time isn't, then they come apart. And I'm not saying that's the way things are, or even that string theory is committed to that, but I'm saying that that's one possibility. And if that were the case, then yeah. So anyway, and also I think that, you know, simulations give us a really good way of making sense of how there could be hypertimes and other things like this. So it's perfectly, I mean, we do this all the time. We run simulations at very slow speed. So, you know, they had this deep blue mouse brain that now has led to the human brain project or whatever, you know, and so they simulated like one a cortical column or something like that, you know, like a less than 100 nanoseconds of neural activity, and they did it, but it took them like a week or something. I mean, I forget. I should have looked this up again, but it took them a long time. And it's gonna be the case that if we ever do fire up the Human Brain Project, probably it'll be running a brain at like, you know, 1/4 speed or 1/8 speeds, very slowly. So, and how do you make sense of that? Well, you make sense of it by saying that, you know, the rate of time in the simulation is passing at a different rate with respect to the time outside the simulation.
There's some thought experiments I want to run by you.
Okay.
It's one of my favorite things ever. So there's, you know, I mentioned in one of our previous conversations this Greg Egan, an Australian science fiction author, and he's got this book called Permutation City, which is all about simulations and people living within simulations within simulations. Right. And early in the book, there's this scientist who's running a simulation of himself, and he's doing this experiment about the phenomenology of time in a simulation. So he wants to see if there's any phenomenological difference from the point of view of the simulated version of himself with respect to different ways of running the simulation. The first thing he's doing is like slowing it down and speeding it up. Okay. And intuitively, it's like, yeah, right. Of course, it's not going to seem any different from the inside.
Oh, is this where you get your slow down, switch down, switch fest or whatever that stuff? Is that where we're going here?
No, that's not where I'm going with it though. The really interesting part of the thought experiment is when he starts really messing with what's going on in the outside the simulation, when he is running the simulation backwards. So from the outside point of view, the simulation is being run backwards. You know, there's a lot of computations that are reversible.
Right.
You can run them backwards, and it's still the same computation.
And physicists like to say that the physical world is reversible in that sense.
So he runs it backwards, and then another thing that he does is he runs it out of order. So he like runs the third chunk first and the first chunk last. You know, he parses it, and so that starts getting weird. I mean, now my intuitions start some of my intuitions say, yeah, right. It doesn't matter. But like
Matter
now,
from what for what though? For like the experience or from the
yeah. Would you always have the same phenomenology in all these situations? So no matter how slow the simulation is, the phenomenology inside the simulation is always going to be the same. How
right?
about if you run it backwards? The phenomenology won't be any different from when you ran it forwards. From the
It'll be
inside,
back.
it's still forwards.
It'll be backwards. You say,
Ah, okay. So
but backwards from the outside.
it's backwards from the outside, but on the inside, it's just the same.
Yeah,
So
but that's the whole point about this hypertime and these kinds of outside and
but, but, but,
inside
but wait a
questions.
minute. I just want to be clear what your answer is. So in the story, at the end of each experiment, the guy outside the simulation, he comes into the simulation and says, "Okay, did you notice a difference there?" That's the end of that was the end of experiment number 13. Was that the same as experiments 1 through 12? So at the end of each experiment, he pops in and he asks the guy on the inside of the simulation, "You notice anything different this time?" And every time he says, "Nope, it was just the same."
So
And
let me
so my
get this
question to
straight because I
you,
haven't read. I don't know if
okay,
I'm answering you're trying to do a bait and switch and a hook and a sucker on me here. So,
no, actually,
um,
honestly, this is
but
not.
my view about this stuff is that all these stories are either described to the point where they beg a question or under described to the point where it's not answerable. So I think that the use of these kinds of stories is intuition pumping at best and mongering at worst. But that's a different story. That's a different question. So let me ask you though what we're talking about here.
Yeah,
So let's suppose that you say, okay, Richard, we're doing the experiment right now, and here's the experiment. You're gonna pick up this jar of delicious sun tea, which was made when there was sun, not happening at the moment, and you're gonna drink it, and then you're gonna reflect on the taste experience you have, sweet with the taste of black tea, so I can
yeah,
taste that.
yep,
And then you're going to do that several times in a row, you say to
right.
me. And I'm going to ask you each time whether it's the same or different as before. So
Yeah,
that's the setup.
phenomenologically, right, right. That's exactly the setup.
Okay. Now, before we go to the thought experiment, can I just tell you that in real life, people are terrible at this, and that there is something called choice blindness, which is related to our favorite thing called change blindness. But I was just reading a paper about this actually this morning. So it's fresh in my mind. But
Yeah, I don't know what choice blindness is.
so it's where you have people taste things. Like let's say you taste pudding.
Uh-huh.
And you taste tapioca and or dark chocolate and light chocolate, or two. I mean, they taste they're different things. So let's just say pudding, because I am in the mood for pudding. Vegan pudding, please, for me. So now you taste it, and then you say which one you like better. So you rate your
Yeah.
preferences. And then, because these are psychologists and they're sneaky, what they do is they come back to you and they say, "Oh, right, we see that you rated these, but we made a mistake. We need you to rate them again," or whatever. I forget the details, but they say you need to rate them again. So the subjects are under the impression they're rating the same stuff, and they give them the same containers. Like it'll be a container with a blue lid and a container with a green lid. But unbeknownst to the subjects, they've switched the contents. So now and while they're saying, here, this is the one that you previously before said that you really liked. Can you taste it again and just remind us what you really liked about it? But really they're tasting the one that they said they did not like. And yet, guess what? They don't notice it. And some of
Uh-huh.
these are weird. Like one of them is like equivalent to the difference of like strawberry jam versus peach jam, which is like, how can you not notice that that has been switched? Now, they don't get the visual cues because they're in this kind of closed container and they're just going off a taste or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you ask them now, what was it you liked about this? They start saying stuff, but it's the one that they said they didn't like previously. So they seem not to notice that there's been this switch. There's been this switch here. So I don't know. Does this matter to the story that you're telling? Because are these kind of judgments on the basis of an individual in a situation like this?
Well, it's like a thought experiment, like
Yeah, it's an intuition problem. So this is what I'm getting at. There's a difference between the science and our just kind of going, oh, my intuitions are getting massaged over here.
yeah, I don't know. I like thought experiments.
Okay, well,
I don't
but
even
so
think I like
let
them.
me let
I
me
like
tell you
I like dancing
about what I
pony and
say
thought
about this thought
experiments.
experiment. I say that if what you're saying is accurate, and that if one case it's run forward and the other case it's run backwards, there has to be a difference from within the simulation that you would notice.
But you wouldn't notice the slowdown, whether the simulation was slowed down or not.
No.
So on the inside, it'll be the same. But if you do run it backwards, there'll be a difference.
It seems intuitive to me that if you were not that maybe as you were going through it, but later if you were asked, you know, which happened first, your taste of the tea or your drinking it, you would come to a different judgment if it were run backwards.
So now there's one way of saying that intuition, the one that you just reported,
yeah,
that intuition is related to something that we were talking about earlier in this conversation today about separating phenomenology from the metaphysics of time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that intuition is that there has to be some kind of tight connection between the phenomenology of time and the metaphysics of time. That you can't have the reality be going backwards and the phenomenology be going forward.
Well, no, that's not right. You can't have the reality going backwards, but the representations of it. I mean, look, if this is really right, then your representations are all they're indicating this one was caused by that one, this one came after that one. And if you're having them in reverse order, it's going to seem weird.
No, it's not.
On reflection, it's going to seem weird.
No, it's going to seem the same. At any given moment, so we pick a moment in the simulation and compare it to its corresponding moment
right.
in the forward simulation. But in each moment, the representations have the same content. They each have the content that I was just having a migraine, but I'm not having a migraine anymore. And it doesn't matter whether in reality the next representation is going to be a representation of a migraine versus a representation of there no longer having been a migraine. At that moment, they're the same representation, and they both have the content that the migraine was in the past. It's just that in one of them, in reality,
is that the half? Phew! Saved by the bells.
Oh, you don't have to answer my question.
Saved by the bells. No, I know. I get what you're saying. You know, I started wondering like how much of this is so this is a kind of a kind of similar thought experiment to the I guess I would say to the dancing and fading qualia thought experiments.
Yes.
And I guess what I would say is that, yeah, while that sounds like really fucked up and therefore probably not the way the actual world is, but yeah, and I guess I would be forced to say something like that. Yeah, you couldn't tell.
Right.
Even though that seems, that my strong intuition that seems strongly fucked up would lead me to believe that's good reason to think it's not actually happening, although it's not impossible. But I don't know. Yeah, so I would, yeah, that's thought experiments are useful for making
I'm with you on that one. Can I lay one more on you?
Yeah, but in this half hour, remember, I wanna defend my view. But not my view. I want to actually try out Kripke's argument against four-dimensionalism and see what you think about that.
Okay.
So, but you go first. Thought
okay,
experiment number 2.
So this is something that I've been obsessed with since I was like in high school. It's the Einstein book from Gödel, Escher, Bach.
Yeah.
By Douglas Hofstadter.
Exactly.
And so the Einstein book is it's a book that has a computer program written in it, and the computer program is a program for simulating Einstein's brain.
Right.
And you run the program like Searle runs the Chinese understanding program. You like page through the book and you follow the instructions. And when I was an undergrad, my logic professor was this guy, Patrick Hayes, who he is a philosophy professor, but also a computer science guy, and he was like really huge in early artificial intelligence. I think he gets credit for having discovered the frame problem.
Oh, cool. Right.
So, anyways, I told him about the Einstein book, and I asked him this question. I said, two-part question. First part, because he's like a hardcore functionalist, like super like believer in strong artificial intelligence. I said, first off, does it matter for the point? How fast you run the program? He's like, no, it doesn't matter. From the inside, it'll seem to Einstein like everything is normal.
Right.
And then I asked him, the second part was, well, why do you even have to run the program?
Right.
isn't just the book, the book itself, without anyone turning the pages or running the program, doesn't that contain the entirety of Einstein's subjective experience? And so even though the program's not being run from the inside, and he said, no, you got to run the program.
Yeah, you have to run it, and running requires temporal passage. Is that where this is going?
And so like, you know, I said, like, look, I share that intuition, but like, why do you have to have, why does the program have to be run? Why isn't it doesn't it suffice that you've got everything
right? So this
there?
is a kind of eternal. I wonder about this view sometimes when I think about eternalism.
Oh yeah, they're so super related, right?
And pan-computationalism as well. So
yeah.
Why isn't just the static representation of a program enough to have the program being implemented? I think it's because it deeply ingrained is the idea that a program is just, I mean, is a set of instructions that need to be executed. And that, you know, there's this old famous quote that time is God's way of stopping everything from happening at once. And I don't know who, I don't know who said that. That's, I think, relevant to worries about that maybe. I mean, I don't know. I don't know this guy, so I'm not sure what he's saying. But one worry you might have is, yeah, if they're not temporally segregated and don't happen one sequentially, one after another, then what's the difference between that and saying they're happening all at once? And that doesn't seem to make sense. The whole idea of computation, which is breaking down things into simple steps, which can be iterated and repeated.
Yeah.
So you need temporal notions that make sense of how programs function, I think, or how computation works.
Maybe the temporal notions can just reduce, you know, so go back to set theoretic Pythagoreanism from, what was that, episode 2?
A New Hope.
A New Hope. So
oh, that's episode 4, sorry. I just failed my Star Wars exam. Shit.
This is, I think, Attack of the Clones.
Right, damn it.
Right, so, but anyway, like, you know, sets aren't intrinsically temporal. You get you get time into it after you've built numbers, and then you build these ordered tuples, and time is just going to be one of the coordinates in this like this.
And it doesn't look like you need moving or anything. You just need the set of coordinates.
That's right. That's right. So there's a sense in which, on that view, the entirety of reality is just a closed Einstein book.
Yeah, that, you know, I was playing around with that view when I was thinking about when Eric and I were talking about his idea for what is that? What does he call it? Kant meets cyberpunk or whatever.
Yeah, switch cable.
Yeah, switch cable. Yeah. But so I was thinking one cool idea would be just that the universe is just this static program.
Right.
And what we perceive as 3D objects, I mean, in a way, it kind of fits with Hoffman's view, Donald Hoffman, you know, who has this idea that the experience we have of ordinary physical objects is akin to desktop icons on your computer, and that what a desktop icon does is stand for a certain, you know, a certain location in memory, a certain data structure, a certain set of bits and zeros and ones or whatever. And so when you click on it and manipulate it, you are interacting with something that's computational at a deep level. But the icon, of course, is designed to hide all that complexity and designed to make it really super easy for you to interact with it. And so his idea is, the same with the table and the chairs and the sun and the moon. It's kind of like an icon. It's the way consciousness represents or the deep structure of reality, but we're cut off from it. And of course, he has a weird panpsychist version, and I'm not going that far, but you know, I'm not going any way with him. But I'm just saying, it fits with what he's saying. But the interesting thing underneath it would be a static, unchanging, eternal, just set list of computations and computational instructions, but that are never run. They're just there, and then this is the result of it. The illusion of running and passage and stuff. And, you know, I think that's like a super weird view.
Yeah. Kiss your presentism goodbye.
Kiss your presentism goodbye. Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I don't know how to I mean, this is why I like talking with Eric and people like Eric, is because I'm not afraid of strange ideas, and I like common sense, and I don't think you should violate it too quickly in line with your principle. I don't think you should throw it away at the first step and, you know, so forth. But at the same time, I've been convinced since I was a small child that something crazy has to be true. I mean, you read Einstein, you learn about quantum mechanics, stuff's weird. You learn about Cantor, things get weirder. I mean, something weird has to be true. So I think that a lot of times we close debate off with incredulous stares and mocking and sort of debate setting. And, to be honest with you, I think people like Dennett kind of are a pernicious influence in this sense. And
you're always pooping on my man Dennett.
Yeah, I'm not fond of him. And, he wrote this paper called Higher Order Truths About Schmess.
Yeah, I love that paper.
Really condescendingly says, look, guys, don't waste a whole generation of smart people working on stuff that's bullshit. Whereas I say, look, we need to explore all these possibilities, all the theories, all the relations between them. Let people explore what's interesting to them and stop trying to tone police and agenda set. And how about just let smart people think about ideas? How about that? And how about stop telling people to stop pursuing ideas because you personally think they're a waste of time?
I think, I agree with both of you guys.
I'm against door shutting.
I agree with both of you guys. I think you can't legislate what's interesting. That you got to be just maximally democratic about it and let people follow whatever. But at the same time, I do think each person should worry about, they should ask themselves, am I just doing, did I just get stuck into some local minimum because like some professor complimented me because my work was similar to his work? You should.
Well, that's an important point. No, I'm telling people to pursue their heart. I'm telling people the opposite. That when you come into a seminar with a strange idea and someone says, "Oh yeah," like the professor in most cases, or people dismiss and what gets published in journals. Again, this is something that Marcus Arvin talks a lot about on the blog Philosopher's Cocoon. That there's a kind of limiting to what gets counted as interesting. By the way, he posted this really cool thing to Ruth Milliken's Dewey lectures where she worries about the pace of philosophy. And not only philosophers worry, but it's the same with physics. So, Higgs himself published, when he got the Nobel Prize for the Higgs boson, he says, look, I don't know if I could have been a physicist nowadays because the way I came up with all this stuff was, working very slowly on thinking about stuff at my own pace and what wasn't popular but I thought was interesting. And I think that's something that we should have. We need, so again, in this idea of exploring modal space, remember that's the modal knot, or whatever word that is, kind of mapping out what things are consistent, which things are not consistent, what relations of entailment and so forth are there between all that stuff. Something similar-esque to something like the project that you get in Chalmers Constructing the World, although I don't agree with everything he says there. I think that's an interesting kind of idea, to just map out the chart to see, just cartography, just, sailing, what's connected to what, and where are the joints, and a lot of people get locked into their theorizing. They go, that's not a joint, and then someone comes along and they go, oh, that is a joint, actually. You can sever that, and that does come apart, and then you get non-Euclidean geometry, or you get speaking of Ted Sider, you get his temporal counterpart theory. I mean, so people start coming out with interesting new ideas. Some of them are got to be useful and interesting. So
like
that's
the multiple draft theory of consciousness. That's pretty good. It's a good one.
I say let them pursue it.
Yeah.
But it's funny because I was watching this video from. I'll just stop talking about that. I was watching this video from the Tucson because I didn't get to go this year because I'm broke.
Yes.
And so I was watching a video though where they were talking with Deepak Chopra, and I'm not a big fan of Deepak Chopra. You know what I mean? And in fact, I sort of have flirted with the idea that he's possibly a charlatan, and not because of because Eastern philosophy is bad. I like Eastern philosophy.
Yeah, right. Same here.
But he was involved with this weird product called Zri, which was this like. It was basically elderberry juice with some other stuff, and it was marketed as this really like ancient Ayurvedic kind of herbal medicine.
Yeah.
And I agree that it's good to drink elderberry juice, and turmeric does help with arthritis, swelling, and so forth. But they were marketing it as this kind of like tier structure where you have to recruit people. I mean, so anyway, he was like this associated with it in some way as like the spokesman or somehow endorsing it, and I was turned off by that. He seems like he's really into marketing this Eastern stuff as opposed to exploring. To me, that's my personal take on it, that he's more interested in money than ideas, and whatever. So I don't find myself attracted to that view or that worldview, that money is more important than exploration. But anyway, and maybe that's not fair, and I'd be willing to be corrected if someone wants to defend Deepak. But anyway, so he was being interviewed on this thing, and they were asking about Dennett. They were like, "Oh, Dennett was here, and he was, you know, saying this stuff." And Deepak said, "Well, I'd have to drink a lot before I took Dennett's view seriously, and I don't drink." And I was like, I was like, the only time in my life I've ever found myself in agreement with something that Deepak said.
By the way, two things, and then I want to get you to get on Kripke.
Okay.
First thing is, if you haven't seen, I highly recommend a short little YouTube video of Richard Dawkins and Deepak. You know, Richard Dawkins kind of a jerk in his own way, but this is great. And he, you know, my interpretation is like there's a point in the video where Deepak gets afraid. You got to see it. I don't want to spoil it. Second thing is,
I'll watch it.
Some future episode we got to dedicate to. You got to let me set the record straight about Dennett. I think, you know, I do think that he has a kind of negative aspect. I agree with you on some of that, but I think that some of his positive views are actually deserve more of a hearing on this show, and so I want to be Dennett.
That's fine. I feel like he gets enough of a hearing, and there's kind of a hero worship kind of thing going on amongst some people.
Underdog. But,
yeah, and that's fine. But look, and you know, and I also don't, and again, I also don't approve of his tone or rhetoric in the philosophy of religion debates, even though I might secretly agree with a lot of the stuff he says. I think it's bad.
Yeah, well, I think you and I agree about that, the tone issue. Let's do Kripke.
Yeah, let's do Kripke. Someone completely different tone. Kripke's a sweetheart in the truest sense of the term sweetheart. At least now, anyway. Although there's rumors about him, and I don't want to rumor monger or whatever. But I've only known him in his elder doddering age, and he's done some strange things. But generally, he's been very nice, and in the time I've spent with him, I mean, I haven't spent a lot of time with him. Don't get me wrong, but I've taken classes with him. And also, recently, I was at that conference I mentioned, the big Kripke conference. And he was very nice and generous with his time, and I think he's funny and a nice guy. But I understand there's issues with him, and I know that's a touchy subject. But anyway, so one of the interesting things, you know, because I think that Kripke is secretly an actualist and also a presentist, but I don't know. He also says weird things.
And a theist.
He's definitely a theist, I think. I mean, I remember one of the classes I had with him, and it was funny, Michael Devitt was sitting in on that class on that day, and it was supposed to be on, theories of reference and stuff, and Kripke started the class by spending like half an hour talking about what a shame it was that philosophers of language spent time talking about Superman and Clark Kent and Aquaman and this kind of stuff, when really they should be reading the Bible and they could talk about Moses. And he was like, why aren't there more biblical examples? And then Michael Devitt was like, all fully religious today, Saul. And then that was it, and he moved on. But yeah, he's definitely religious, but whatever. I'm not, I'm not against that, as long as you're not religious in the sense of, trying to force a religion. I'm agnostic on the question of what we should believe about that stuff. So, and I think he is too. I think that Kripke is honest about what he does, what he's open to, and what he's not, and where he doesn't know the answers. He's, if you actually listen and talk to him, he's very clear that, like, some things he finds very confusing. He doesn't know what to say. And identity through time, by the way, is one of them. I had one of my first classes I had with Kripke was on identity through time and what it means for an object to exist through time. And it's very clear that this is something that's very puzzling to him. And he doesn't quite know what the right answer is, I feel like. And I think that's the right attitude about it. Anyway, the preamble is open. What? So yes, I'm going to get to that. But what I was going to say, though, is that the causal theory of reference gives one a way to understand, I think, some typical objections about truth makers, about how we refer to past things like Socrates. And so I think that's useful to answer those objections. What does it mean to refer to Socrates? Well, it's to be in a mental state which is causally and historically related to the guy. And the guy doesn't have to be around anymore for that historical chain to have been the thing which produced the thing in my head. So there doesn't have to be a literal chain, but it has to be a series of causes that lead to the thing being there now. And so I do think that this is very congenial to thinking about presentism. But you're right. The actual argument is the rotating disk argument, which I think is kind of famous in the oral tradition, and people have, it's not been published as far as I know. But you know this, right? That's what you said, the rotating disk?
Yeah. One of us should summarize it.
Go ahead, you do it.
So it's important that the disk is homogeneous.
Yeah.
And if you think about from the point of view of a four-dimensionalist, what the disk is, what the disk really is it's a cylinder.
Yeah.
It's a cylinder, and
A
what
worm.
we call it's a worm, space-time worm. And
like those 4th of July things that you light, and the worms.
Yeah. And I once did this really gross thing in class. I was explaining this because I teach this class, the philosophy of space and time.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the disk argument. I said, okay, picture this. Picture this long hot dog. And now, if the disk were non-homogeneous,
yeah,
if the disk had a red dot on it, and the disk,
some clues.
Yeah, and so the disk were rotating, then from the point of view of the 4th dimensionalist, the hot dog has a spiral. It has a worm inside of it.
Yeah.
There's a vein inside of it, and it's twisting around.
Okay, this is getting a little uncomfortable for me, to be honest.
Yeah, see, like I grossed everybody out in the class. They're like, "Oh man, Dick."
Well, I'm vegan, and that's
also
yeah.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, but I am.
Can it be a veggie dog at least? I mean, it's still going to be phallic in an inappropriate way.
It's got a gummy worm in it.
A gummy worm is better.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, from the point of view of.
But that's why, by the way, Kripke, when he actually runs this argument, he simplifies it by talking. He makes the kind of holographic claim that anything you could describe in 3 dimensions plus time, you could describe in a simplified 2-dimensional structure. So you don't need it to be a cone or cylinder. You can just have a 2-dimensional thing. You still get the same idea. But just makes it simple.
So all there is the cylinder, and if it's a homogeneous disk for the 4-dimensionalist, there'd be no difference.
And that's all that there is. That's right. So it's only
that's all that there is. And so for the 4-dimensionalist, there would be no difference between the disks rotating and the disks not rotating. Now,
that's not true. Well, you're rushing it a little bit.
Wait. Well, let me do my fast version, then you can fix it up afterwards.
Yeah.
So if the disk is homogeneous, for example, if it has a red spot on it, then there is a difference between for the 4-dimensionalist, there is a difference between it's rotating and it's not rotating. If it's not rotating, then what will correspond to the red dot is a straight line, a straight red line inside of the pink cylinder. But if the disk is rotating, then you'll have a red curly Q inside of the pink cylinder. However, if the disk is homogeneous, then all you have in either case is a pink cylinder. So if there is some real difference between a homogeneous disk rotating and a homogeneous disk not rotating, that's not a difference that the 4-dimensionalist can account for. So therefore, 4-dimensionalism is false. That's my understanding of how the argument is supposed to go.
Exactly. So that's basically right. So the 4-dimensional theory, but see, I think you left out the kind of crucial claim of the 4-dimensional theory, which is that really there's not a disk, but a series of instantaneous disks or time slices.
Yeah, there's just the cylinder.
It's just the cylinder, but the cylinder is kind of a representation of a bunch of slices, though. So they're separate, and that in a sense, each moment or time slice is like unchangeable and eternal. It's set, and then the next one that comes after that. So that if you think of the history of this disk, it's just going to be a series of these still not moving things.
Right.
And then Kripke's claim is that you cannot in any way account for the motion of the disk in this series of still images, or still holographic slices or whatever, time slices, but yet there's intuitively an objective fact about whether the disk is moving or not.
The way you're describing it,
sorry?
The way you're describing it, Richard, it doesn't really matter whether it's a homogeneous disk or a non-homogeneous disk. You just say, like, at each instant, it's not moving.
It really does. It almost doesn't matter whether it's homogeneous or not. And the homogeneity of it is trying to just avoid a certain objection, which is to say that all there is to the disk's motion is a certain dot being at one location in one slice, and then that same dot being at a different location. And then they would say, oh, well, there's a way to, because, you know, this is, by the way, this is how physicists like to cheat and get out of Zeno's paradoxes. And this might bring us back to this, you know, full circle here. I don't know if you have any timers here or not going on, but
we've got 8 minutes left.
Well, that's not fair, because we didn't talk about Kripke for part of the first 8 minutes. But anyway, so a lot of people will say, look, the way that Zeno's paradoxes about time are solved by Newton is by introducing something called instantaneous velocity, velocity at an instant. And so what that means, though, according to Newton, is simply that at the next instant you'll be somewhere else. So he recognizes that at that given instant you're not in motion, but he says what it means to be in motion is that the next instant, you're not in the same place relative to, you know, time and absolute space or whatever. So that you can, but that you give up something there, which is that at any given instant, you cannot say whether the thing is in motion or not without referring to the next instant or the previous instant. Because what it means to be in motion is just to say, over this series of time slices, the thing is in different locations at different time slices. Right. And it's that thing, I think, really, that Kripke is responding to, this way of the four-dimensionalist trying to capture or make sense of what motion would be. And he says, no, that's not good enough, because now think about this. What if the disk is homogeneous? So there's nothing in the next time slice which is different at all from the time slice point of view. So you can't even play this game about, oh, well, it's in a different, the instantaneous velocity game doesn't work. I mean, he's really, I think, trying to undermine this Newtonian idea that instantaneous velocity captures what we mean by moving over time. And so what, in that sense, you're right. Once you get that far, you could almost put the thing back in there and say, look, the basic question here is really, is instantaneous velocity really doing justice to what we mean by moving? And you know, I think someone like Kripke is going to argue no. So, but anyway, let's make it homogeneous. So I think you're right, though, that you picked up on that. That the way I think of it, it doesn't really matter whether it is homogeneous or not. And because, you know, even in this class where he was floating this argument, people were objecting. Oh, well, homogeneous matter is not real. And Kripke got really sort of annoyed and pissed off by that. He was like, what? People, it's like, who cares? Yes, it's not real, but Aristotle thought it was, so it's perfectly impossible that there is homogeneous matter.
I want to use the Aristotle thought it was move more often. I think my life would be a lot easier if I could just say, look, by the way, Aristotle thought, you know, Aristotle had an a priori argument for why there had to be men on the moon.
Yeah.
You know that one?
Was it? No, I don't.
So there's all these elements, right?
Yeah.
Four or five elements, and so the other elements that we're aware of, there are creatures that are proper to those elements. So water has got fish in it, and the earth has worms in it, and the air has birds in it. Maybe this is an inductive argument,
right?
Or, I don't know what kind of argument it is, but
so there must be something adapted to the moon, is what he was saying.
Well, so fire is an element. We've not observed on Earth any fire creatures, but the moon is made out of fire. So and there's got to be fire creatures. So that's where they are. They're on the moon.
Well, in the sun. I mean, if you just turn it to the sun, exactly. Too. That's where it's clear their fire creatures are there. But anyway, so you can say Aristotle, you can call him the Macedonian, as certain people we know like to call him. The Macedonian, you know who calls him that, right? Or you could call him, with greater term of respect, the philosopher, as the master of those who know.
But anyway, I like
Kripke. So the basic argument, as I see it, is there's a basic feature of reality that cannot be accounted for in four-dimensional terms. That is the fact that there is a fact of the matter about whether this thing is in motion or not, you can't make sense of that. Now, no one, as far as I know, has ever said, well, maybe there's just no fact of the matter about whether it's in motion. I don't know if I wouldn't want to say that, but I wonder if anyone has ever just like said, yeah, in a universe where there's only a homogeneous, I mean, isn't this kind of like the Leibniz thing? In a world where it's just one sphere, does it make sense to say that it's moving in any direction at all?
I don't know the future, but this seems like a pretty obvious move to go say, like, you know what, fuck it. There is no difference. There's no difference.
I think, though, that it's intuitive that there should be a difference.
Yeah. like I've been slipping deeper and deeper into Kantianism recently,
Nice.
and one way you could go with this is to say like, look, we can conceive of it, and so therefore what? Well, it does tell us something about our conception of space and time. I don't know if you can go whole hog and say this tells us something about space and time itself.
But how about if it tells us something about the way we model space and time, and that four-dimensional
Yeah.
modeling doesn't really capture or do justice to what we're... So if that's
Right.
true, because that's a pretty striking conclusion that, therefore, if general relativity is committed to four-dimensionalism, general relativity doesn't actually capture or model the way we think reality might be.
Right.
That's a pretty bold claim. In fact, I remember Kripke kind of saying in class that he was like, almost hesitant to give an argument that had such a striking claim, because he's just doing it on a priori. So he is sensitive to the idea that he doesn't want to. It seems weird to refute relativity on the basis of a priori, or not relativity, but four-dimensionalism on the basis of a priori considerations.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do think that this is an interesting argument.
Yeah.
It does seem to me very. Now people have tried to respond by, oh well, you can include like, arrows or like force vectors or something in the representation, the instantaneous moments, and that would give you some clue as to what was going on in there. And then he goes, well, what are those grounded in, though? Like, you could add them arbitrarily, but how do you know when to add them and when not to add them?
Right.
And this is, I remember thinking in this class that in the case of the bucket, we have an answer here, because, there are forces being acted on the bucket. So one thing you might want to do is ask yourself whether a person that was on there would experience any forces or something like that. But then that's not the way the thing is set up.
Right.
But I do think that this kind of forces you towards some kind of substantialism about space. If you really think there's an answer to this question, it must be because there's some like background against which there's an objective answer to this thing being in motion or not. So I do think that this substantialism is kind of in the background here. And that, well, I don't know, because in the Zimmerman article, I think I remember him saying that in order to make sense of relativity theory, you need substantialism. So maybe, and in fact, in the Maudlin book, he claims that substantialism is necessary to make sense of this stuff too. So maybe there's just no getting around substantialism unless you like string theory and you realize
Maudlin's solution to the Newton bucket is kind of substantialism, and that's something we discussed in our lost episode.
Exactly, which is went out for a 3-hour tour and just never came back.
That's right. But it's on an island somewhere making a moonshine still out of bamboo.
It's lost in space on an island. But so anyway, so this Kripke argument I think is a fairly serious challenge to the four-dimensionalist model which to bring this full circle, how we started with this kind of, so you have people like Britt Brogard, and I think she gives an interesting kind of take on what a four-dimensional kind of presentism, which I think is an interesting view. And of course, like I said earlier, I would kind of join that with some views about grounding, where I'd probably say the same about mind and brain, that the mind is grounded in the brain, and what that means is that it's a priori deducible or something like that, or hamada, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know. So grounding seems interesting, and a lot of people are using that notion. So I like this kind of, the past is real in this sense, in the sense that it's deducible or grounded in or somehow related to in a kind of metaphysical way to the present. I like that idea. But I like Kripke's stuff, and I think that puts pressure on four-dimensionalism as being kind of being an accurate model of the physical world. And then I think, you know what? And maybe you can see Kripke's argument as dovetailing with the kind of string theory arguments, which suggest that space is not a fundamental element or feature, and so that it's wrong to model space and time as a kind of static four-dimensional structure in the way that Minkowski space-time does. Now, I don't know. So that's speculation. But then again, that's why we're here. I hope that under every episode there should be a disclaimer that
we're full of shit.
Well, no, that we're exploring, that we're engaging in exploratory dialogue. But I don't have. haven't published any of this stuff in a book. I would defend it, I guess, but I don't know if I really truly believe it. I don't know what I believe. These questions are hard, I think.
Yeah.
And I think that, having these kind of discussions helps me think through them. And I think, that's why we're having them, not because I have I do have an axe to grind. Like I said, I want to try to defend as much as like what I believed before I became a philosopher as possible. And what I believed before I became a philosopher was presentism, actualism, phenomenal realism about consciousness, like all that free will, all that stuff, maybe none of it's real, and maybe I will have to give it up, but I haven't, I was reading this paper the other day on something about this, and they were saying, relativity theory just makes it the case that presentism's dead in the water. It's not a respectable theory. You have to be a crazy religious person like William Lane Craig and not really understand general relativity and say strange things. And I went, wow, but that's not true. There are respectable versions of these theories that just are underexplored. And so I think it's interesting to explore them.
I want to ask you about exploration, and I want to ask if you have the following experience as a teacher.
Yeah.
And this is an experience I've had many, many times, and that is if I'm teaching a subject that I really know inside and out, like, my main thing is philosophy of mind. The students are a little bit bored.
Yeah.
I feel like those classes are just kind of, those days are just kind of not so exciting. But when I'm teaching something that's kind of new to me, I'm just teaching it because I want to learn about it.
Right.
Those are the classes where it feels like the students are really into it, and the whole thing is really exciting. And I wonder if you have a similar
I do, but I try to make all my classes like that second kind of class.
You don't talk about things you're an expert on.
I don't feel like I'm an expert on anything except what a lot of people have said about these topics, and all of them are probably wrong. So I don't think I'm an expert on consciousness, except for I have it. I know. So from the inside, I'll say certain things. I'm an expert on what Bloch says about consciousness. I'm an expert on what Chalmers says about consciousness. I'm even an expert about what Dennett says about it, although begrudgingly an expert because it's required by the field. But nonetheless, that's where the expertise lies. It lies in understanding the views and positions and argumentative moves within that space, that structural space. Yeah. But what do I believe about all that stuff? I don't fucking know.
But you have the experience that your classes are just more enjoyable for the students when you yourself are exploring things.
Well, I try to present it in that way. I try to present it in terms of, look, who the hell knows what's going on? Let's try to be serious and look at what people have said, and then also what we think, and have a discussion about it.
Yeah.
And that is a kind of exploration. Now, you're right. You anticipate certain moves, and people will say things. That move's already been made, and you can get into this kind of it's all But pedagogically, one of the things that really allowed me to be free, I think, and it's interesting, is the recording of my lectures in video form. Because once I got it out of I felt like, there's always this battle about, I have to cover this material in class because, you have this really full of yourself view that unless I explain it to them, they can't possibly understand it. And I understand that's a bit egocentric, and, I don't think I'm that great of a teacher, but I do feel like teachers have that view, like, oh, we didn't, and students do too. They say, we didn't talk about that in class. I didn't know I had to know that. You say it's in the book, and they look mystified.
Right.
Whoa, book. But on the same time, discussion and exploration to me is important. So there's always that battle in class where you're exploring something that someone says, and the class unfolds in a nonlinear way where you might have said something, and then you go, oh, well, we didn't really systematically cover this, and I wonder if they really understand that this comes before that, and Descartes didn't know Socrates, and because sometimes students will say things like, we'll ask you questions about whether Descartes knew Socrates, and you'll go, no, we're talking about them together, but long time in between. Yeah. So
this is freeing the video.
My point was that by recording these lectures, I felt like I got it out of my system. And now if we get sidetracked in class, I go, oh yeah, and by the way, I have this sort of well put in a video, so watch that to get clear on the relation here. But in class, we can kind of deviate from it. So to me, that would help me sort of try to recapture some of the spontaneity in the classroom.
Interesting. Yeah, I wrote a book, and that helped.
Yeah. By the way, my students like your book.
Oh, thank you.
Some of them were suspicious when they found out that we knew each other, and there was this general feeling of, am I trying to get them to make you money? And I said, no, not really. It's just a good book, and he happens to be,
If they knew how little money I made,
exactly.
they
Well,
would
they
be
have. See,
for
they
me.
don't realize that the authors are they're under the impression that there's a shit ton of money being made, and they're correct. And that money is being made by academic book publishers and book
Right.
houses.
Yeah, not the authors.
Not the authors. That's exactly right.
I'm just,
We're indentured servants to the academic publishers.
I'm just some weird obsessive dude that wanted to write a book about my favorite
Exactly.
subject.
Exactly. So anyway, so I agree with you though. If you're just giving them a lecture, they don't like it. And if you're just going through stuff that is sort of not exciting or new to you,
Right.
then that's a bit boring as well, at least at the undergraduate level. But it's also hard because, we're trying to have like discussions about quantum mechanics and consciousness, and all of a sudden they're bringing up The Secret. And I'm like going, oh, don't fucking bring up The Secret, dude. I didn't realize that in that book, The Secret, they try to connect it to quantum mechanics and stuff. Like, I've never read it. I just sort of,
Oh yeah.
learned about it secondhand because even though I like weird and wacky ideas, I like seriousness about them. And, just because I'm open to multiverses and simulation, that doesn't mean that I'm into like, it's a giant eyeball flying through space type bullshit, unless there's arguments, and then I'll look at them, and if there's reasons, and wherever the reasons come from, I'll think about them.
Yeah.
But I'm not into like silliness for silliness' sake, or weirdness for weirdness' sake, and I don't appreciate non-seriousness, and I do feel like probably that secret stuff is not serious. And also, I would have to say, if I understand the law of attraction, which says that you get what you want in some sense, or what you think about, you bring to you, I think that has like deep implications for like blame the victim, for like you deserve to be raped if you were raped, you deserve it, you brought it to yourself. Every time somebody says everything happens for a reason, I cry inside, because I think about children dying right now in Crimea, for instance, and I say, oh yeah, everything happens for a reason. Like, people are assholes. Okay, so I agree with that. But if you're telling me that somehow it was meant that that child bleed to death from the stomach wound that it received because of some asshole shooting at you, then fuck that. Everything doesn't happen for a reason.
I object to your calling it not serious. I think that doesn't do justice to its perniciousness. It's actually serious. It's seriously bad and seriously damaging.
I mean, I feel bad. I don't want to like poop on students because students are thinking about stuff and reading this stuff or whatever. But I do think that there's this idea. I think that when you start learning about rape culture and how deeply entrenched in our society this kind of stuff is, there's this attitude about the world being just and people getting what they deserve, which pervades people's thinking, which just ultimately, it's why people feel comfortable saying if you're poor, you deserve to be poor.
Yeah, right.
It's why people feel comfortable saying you were asking for it if you were, and so it hurts me when people say stuff like that. It pains me on a deep and emotional level that this kind of, it's not, to a large extent, it's hard to blame the people because as a product of this deeply entrenched societal structure, it's no surprise that people end up saying stuff like this or thinking this kind of stuff. But I wonder how we would go about changing it. I really do.
I think our podcast will help.
Our podcast will help.
Spread the light of reason.
Okay. Yeah. I know. I do. I was reading. Do you read? Do you know who Bell Hooks is by any chance? Do you know this philosopher?
She's the name.
She's kind of a well-known philosopher, and I like her stuff, and I part of me wants deeply to talk about these issues about race and class, because I have my own issues about class in my background. Being someone from the underclass, single parent, raised on welfare, arrested at an early age, juvenile hauled, all that stuff. So that's not even lower class. That's like the under of the under. And so I have feelings about that, and I've always felt, I worked my way out of that. And I don't want to derail this whole conversation into something. My point of bringing that all up is I have deeply held views about this stuff.
Yeah.
And as a kid, I used to say things to people like, "Don't let my skin color fool you. I'm only white on the outside." And the reason I would say stuff like that is because I felt like it's class that matters, and that race is kind of in a lot of times a distraction, and often they overlap, and class and race overlap in a lot of ways. But that class is really, I think, something that's important. But my point about all this was that as much as I deeply want to have these discussions, I do feel like there's enough already with the white guys talking about these kinds of issues. And I do recognize that we're a couple white guys. So, I mean, it's not like I don't think we ought not to talk about these issues. I just feel like it's time to hear what some other people have to say about these kinds of things. People who are directly influenced by it and affected by it. People like Bell and Hooks and others as well. So even though I feel like I've been through it in some extent, it's washed off now. And I had this amazing experience in a classroom one time where, I wrote about some of this in my dissertation, like the introduction to it, where I kind of vaguely alluded to some of the, background of my actual history. And then one of my students, for some reason, read this. Because I have it on my website, I guess. So, so this student came up to me and they said, "Oh, I read your introduction to your dissertation." I was like, "Wow, thank you." And she said, "Well, I had no idea you've been through so much in your life." And I was like, "Yeah, okay, well, that's what life is." And she said, "I thought you were just another white guy from Connecticut." And this was here in New York City, and I was like, no, definitely not a white guy from Connecticut, but not that that's bad or anything. But what she meant, I think, was that here I was in a tie, in a shirt, teaching a classroom, and she assumed I was a middle class, upper class person, because that's what her experience has brought her to understand. And I was like, but it doesn't look that way. But it does look that way, but I'm not really that. Right. And I do feel eternally out of place because a lot of philosophers are middle class, Right. And I know you're from a working class as well, so we have a similar kind of background in this respect. Yeah. Anyway, so that's all I was going to say is I'm torn because I want to bring people on the podcast to talk about this issue, but I also feel like it's enough with the white guys talking about this issue.
Well, we could bring some non-white, non-guys.
Yeah, and listen to them.
Right.
Not talk over them or like pound our own. That's difficult.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's probably, we always say, do we have time? I'm not sure if we're continuing with this.
We should wind it up. Wind it up, wind it down.
Wind it up, wind it down.
In summary, time.
Well, I think Aquinas said it best when he says, "When I don't wonder about it, it's obvious what it is, but as soon as I think about it, it's completely mysterious what it is." Yeah. And, it's no mystery, I think, that the first two things that we discover are paradoxical are change over time. And that's Zeno's paradox. Parmenides and Zeno are clearly, I think, wrestling with this idea of change and impermanence and temporality and stuff. It's a deep mystery. Deep, deep, deep.
Yeah.
That's why I think probably time more fundamental than space. That's why it should have been time, space, mind.
But maybe mind is the most fundamental.
Oh, man.
Mind, time, space.
Mind, time, space.
So,
or maybe just mind space, minesweeper space.
There's a whole bunch of stuff about time that we didn't cover, and I think we're going to be coming back to it time and time again, Richard.
Oh, God. By the way, that's a good movie. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie about the Jack the Ripper serial who goes through time.
Yeah, no, it's really cool.
Yeah, it's a good movie.
We'll talk about time travel at some point. There's this really cool Sidney Shoemaker journal article from I think the 60s called Time Without Change.
Yeah, right.
Really, really cool. Really
everything
cool.
Shoemaker does is great. I mean,
he's top notch.
Is worth reading. Exactly. He's very careful. He's very patient.
Like that stuff. Sometimes
it's a bit slow and a bit chisel-me, by which I mean chiselming in the philosopher's lexicon sense, where you like, some people I know are just like, oh my God, who does this a lot? Uriah.
I was going to say Uriah Kriegel.
Yeah,
I was reading something about him recently. He's got some new paper out.
Cognitive phenomenology.
Yeah, like, there are 37.
Yeah, exactly.
The number 37 jumped out.
The number
37. I will explore the 37 aspects of the phenomenology of cognition. I'm like,
he's only 5 away from the perfect number of 42. No, but not that that's bad. There's something to be said about precision, but yeah, there's also something said about like, who doesn't do that? Saul fucking Kripke. And you know what? This, I guess, was a nice place to end, to wrap it up, because I remember as a grad student coming to New York, and the two people told me I needed to pay attention to were Ruth Millikan and Saul Kripke. So I remember one of my fellow grad students was like, "Oh, you're going to UConn. They have Ruth Millikan there. I'd never heard of her before." And they said, "Yeah, she's like the next Saul Kripke or something like that." I was like, "Who the hell's Saul Kripke?" So I figured maybe I should figure out who these guys were. And I bought Millikan on Clear and Confused Ideas, and I bought Naming Necessity, and I read both of those. That was my anyway. So anyway, but the thing that struck me, it's a good start, right?
Yeah.
The thing, and then I went and studied with Ruth, and then I went and studied with Kripke, so I got to meet them and then also be directly influenced by them. But anyway, the thing that struck me about Naming Necessity is just that it's like, well, it's the opposite of the way Kripke talks in person, but it's clear, it's concise, it's straightforward, it's devastating, and there's no chiseling, there's no technicality to it. It's completely intuitive.
Yeah.
It's completely like after you read it, you go, why didn't I think of that already?
Right.
And it's not this technical jargon. I mean, yeah, there is and he can do the technical jargon, but it's not there. And so that to impress the crap out of me. And people that can do that, I admire. People like John Searle. People like.
I was going to bring up John Searle. There's a John Searle quote. I forgot where I came across this Searle quote, but he said that one of his professors said, if you think about the truly greats.
No footnotes. Is this the no footnotes?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
But he backed down from that, though. He backed down from that. He said, yes, I used to believe that the truly great philosophy had no footnotes. But now he says he allows it to have some footnotes or something. I forget what he said.
Some footnotes. Yeah, but as far as the stylists go, I disagree with some of the content, but as far as like just a way of doing philosophy and writing philosophy.
Right.
Searle and Kripke, those they're my favorites. I love that.
But see, now would you put Fodor in there? Because I would exclude Fodor.
Oh, I love me some Fodor too.
Okay. See, I think he's a bad writer, and the granny doesn't help, and I don't know if he can help himself with that or not.
I don't like the granny stuff.
I don't like it's condescending, and he's trying to make it sound old-fashioned, but that is granny pisses me off, and So I don't know. I just don't think it's useful, and I don't know why. I mean, yeah, it's better than. I agree with a lot of critiques of what philosophical writing has come to. It's highly technical, overly technical, overly technical, overly technical, like technical to the point of it's just for obfuscation, or I'm not against technicality. Technicality in the service of clarity is a beautiful thing. Who I think does a good job of that? Timothy Williams. But that so it's interesting to me that the norms of philosophical writing are pushing us more towards the technical and less towards the Kripke Searle type stuff. And I wonder if you could write, if you weren't Kripke, and if you could write a paper that was anything as accessible as Naming Necessity and have it published by anyone. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I just wonder. I think that what gets published is highly technical, highly technical. And I do hanker for the good old days. Now, some of it, like for instance, Ruth, I think her work is not highly accessible, but worth reading. And that's she does have a way of explaining what she's saying, but I think she develops her own language, her own technical language, way too quick, and then constantly refers back to it over and over again, to the point where if you're not fully immersed in the system, it's hard. It's so easy to caricature it that's part of the reasons I think that although her work has had impact, it hasn't had the impact it deserves, and that she is kind of a heroic underdog in philosophy. And I think reading her Dewey lecture kind of cements her status as heroic underdog in philosophy, which was already clearly cemented in my book anyway. But once you read it, you realize, heroic underdog status for sure. But when you read Ruth and when you engage with her, you get the sense of someone struggling to express something. And that's what's worthwhile about her. She's not using the technicalities to hide something, but she just doesn't know the right way to say what she's saying. So she's inventing these words and all this stuff because people haven't really said it before. And that, I think, is different, where you're charting new terrain versus, using 1,000 symbols or whatever without paying too much attention to like what they mean or something.
Right.
But anyway, so, I mean, writing's hard. Casting stones in glass houses is my business. I understand that, but I know I'm not a great writer. My writing's terrible. In fact, I was rereading one of my earlier papers, and I was like, if I wasn't me, I wouldn't know what the fuck I was saying, because there's like 50 different interpretations of the sentence right here, and it's not clear which one I mean, it's literally not clear what I mean there. And so, I did the best I could at the time, but a large part of it is that there's this pressure to publish. And
Yeah.
so I will honestly say that some of the things that I published are published simply because I needed them to be published in order to have tenure at my institution. And that I look back on them and I go, well, they're not wrong, but they could be clarified, they could be polished, they could sit for a bit. I would say it differently now. I would focus it different. I'd situate it in a different context, and not for nothing, that's not my best work. Some of it. Some of it I stand by. I'm not going to name names of my papers here, but I don't have that many, so you can look at the 5 or 6 I have and judge for yourself. But my point is that if it weren't for the insane published pressure that I feel at the publish or perish, thing, I wouldn't have published most of the things which I have published right now at this point. Eventually they probably would have been published, I think.
You know what, though? What is it like to think that P?
Yeah. Oh, that paper, that's perfect.
Fine paper.
Well, that's a classic example of this, so I'm glad that you brought that up, because now that you volunteered to do the proofs for that.
Yeah, that's what I got to go do.
I'm of the William James variety. I say, send me no proofs. That's William James. But anyway, so that paper, you know the history of that paper. That was a paper that the original core idea for the central argument of that paper I had a long time ago, like in 2004. And I presented it like all over the place, and we talked about it. I talked about it with everybody. I tried to get it published many times. It was rejected, and I was frustrated. And a couple of times it was rejected for reasons that I thought were just silly and ludicrous, like A, not understanding Rosenthal, and B, conflating implicit with unconscious, and all kinds of just stupid stuff.
Right.
In fact, one time the reviewer wrote such a bad review that I wrote to the editor of the journal, and I said, "Excuse me, but this person didn't read the paper. I don't say this. This is wrong." And yeah. The editor wrote back to me and said the following thing, quote, "I'm glad you found the review helpful."
Wow.
And I said, "Wow, fuck you too, whoever you are." But yeah, exactly. So anyway, but my point is that at the time I was frustrated. But then eventually we talked and we worked together, and now we have that extra component, the general argument, which I think is fantastic. We have our discussion of the further working out of the central argument, which I think really led to that cool part of the paper where we talk about the higher order thought, about the higher order thought. That's so that conscious thought right there. So I think the development of that paper was strengthened by the fact that it wasn't published. It's not published yet. So 2014, 2004, that's 10 years of me working on this idea, talking about it to people, nursing it, responding to objections, arguing with Rosenthal, arguing with you, talking to everybody and their dog about this. And now this paper, I think, is at a point where I am going to say it's one of my strongest papers. And that's because it's the product of all this joint collaboration, not the least of which is our joint collaboration. But this whole history of interacting and presenting these ideas, whereas some of my other papers didn't get the luxury of 10 years of debate and discussion before they were cemented. And I think that's a difference that matters. I also will have to say that paper I'm proud of in a sense, because I think it's probably one of the more original contributions I have to this debate, to think about the relation of higher order theories and cognitive phenomenology, to kind of explore that connection. I don't, some of my other papers, as much as I like the deprioritizing paper, I have to admit that Keith came up with it first, and after I had worked it all out, someone wrote on my blog, "Hey, jerk off, this sounds exactly like what this other guy said." And then I went and read it, and I was like, holy shit, it's exactly the same paper. So it's identical. We make all every move for move. He just wrote it better, and he's more clear about it. And I was like, oh, okay.
Is this how you met Keith?
Yeah, that's how I met Keith. Yeah,
well, so that was a good thing. Like, Keith is great.
Yeah, Keith is great, exactly. And then as a result of that, then we did our Philosophy TV episode, and now we're working on future projects with him, us three together. If I understand, if that's still moving forward, exactly.
It is. I have recent correspondence with him.
Very cool. Very cool. So yeah, no, that's exactly how we met. And we're going on and on here, but it's funny because I remember I was talking to Chalmers about this one time, and he said, "Oh yeah, this argument pops up every once in a while, but still, this guy thought of it first." And he wasn't even talking about Keith; he was talking about, I think, Sturgeon maybe is the guy who thought of it first. And I was like, well, thinking of it first is not such a great thing. It doesn't mean that the argument's not a good argument just because you didn't think of it first.
Right.
And you know what? Even if I didn't think of it first, I still thought of it. And I don't really care who thought of it first. It's still something that I worked out and that I feel very strongly connected to. And so whether someone else thought about it first, I'm going to defend it. And I think defending an argument is more important than thinking of it first or taking credit for who goes in the history books. Although I certainly wouldn't mind if it were the Brown-Frankish objection. You know? I, in some sense, I don't really care who thought of it. I think that this is an important objection that hasn't been fully appreciated by. And one day we'll have to talk about zombies and anti-zombies and stuff.
Yeah.
Because I think that I love that stuff. Anyway, gotta go.
All right, man. Well,
running out of time.
High five.
Teams keep on slipping.
It does. Good to talk to you.
Always good to talk to you. And, by the way, after you click this off, does it go off live for a second?
So I'm going to stop broadcast now, and then we can still talk.
Okay. Later.
So.